Hi, I just wanted to show you what these two organization methods might look like in practice if you're doing a summary and response essay. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes your instructor might specify what option they want you to use. And if that's the case, obviously do what they ask of you. But if they don't, then you'll have to make a decision about which option works best for the particular purpose you're trying to achieve. So I'm working with this same essay we've been looking at, Course Requirement Extortion, which is talking about the price of textbooks. And that essay is a proposal. It's making an argument about a subject. So in my response, I'm going to focus more on what the text says. In other words, I'm going to agree and or disagree with the argument of the text. So that probably makes sense for this type of essay. Whereas you guys, in essay number 2, you're going to be doing an analysis where your response is going to be more focused on how a text is written and interpreting the meaning of a text based on the language that's used. So again, it's always going to depend on the assignment and your purpose for that assignment. So this option one way you could organize this type of essay is to start with summary and then follow it with your response. This is sometimes called the block method, where you do one block of text that's doing one thing and then you shift to a second block that's doing something different. You'll sometimes see this in other types of essays like comparison contrast, for example. But the idea behind it and the reason why it might be an effective option is because it makes it easier for the audience to see the difference between what belongs to the author versus what are your ideas. What sometimes happens if you're not careful, if you're talking about summary and response within the same paragraph, sometimes the audience can get confused and not understand which points are the author's and which points are yours. So again, that sort of method can work. We're going to talk about it in a minute, but you just have to be careful with it. In this method, it's very clear what is summary and what is response, because it even sounds different when you make the shift to this response section. It should probably sound less formal. In this case, it's going to sound more argumentative, but again, it can be effective because of that very clear shift. The other thing to think about is how long your summary and response assignment is supposed to be. I think that this option 1 works the best for a shorter assignment. So let's say your instructor wants this to be 1 or 2 pages. This method works really well. Whereas if they want that assignment to be longer, let's say 3, 4, or 5 pages, you're going to end up with a really long summary section and a really long response section. And what can happen is that you run the risk of the audience sort of forgetting stuff that you discussed in the summary by the time you get to the response, which is not what you want. So again, I think if you have the choice, if you're doing a shorter essay assignment, this option might work best for that. So let's look at what I actually said. So in this case, my first paragraph, my intro, we would say, is going to be entirely summary. So let me just read through it here. Author Michael Granoff, in his essay Course Requirement Extortion, argues that college textbooks are far too expensive for students. Notice that in the first sentence here, I'm introducing the author by his full name and giving the title. The audience needs to know what it is that we're summarizing here. He explains that the used book market does not make books more affordable for students, and in fact, is responsible for publishers' inflated textbook prices. Granoff believes that continuing to focus on used books will only lead to publishers charging more for their texts, since they only make a large profit the first time a book is purchased. Instead, Granoff proposes that schools should license textbooks from publishers and form an agreement that will benefit both the publishers and the students. he claims that students would have to pay far less for their books, which would make college more of an option for those who struggle financially, and textbook publishers would make more money in the long run rather than depending on the initial sale of the book to sustain profits while making nothing afterwards. So notice that a few times throughout this paragraph, I refer to Granoff just by his last name. Like I said earlier, first time you mention an author, give the full name, but after that, refer to them by their last name. Remember, these are called signal phrases, and the purpose is to differentiate between what the author is saying versus what you're saying. If I use his name here, or he, the audience is going to realize that these are his points, and I'm summarizing here. But like we said, this whole first paragraph is me just explaining what Granoff is literally talking about in his text. So let's scroll down here, and we'll shift to my response. Like I said before, it should sound different when you shift to that response section. What I should also say is that, if you were doing a slightly longer assignment, I only wrote this to be a little over a page, but if you had to do a couple of pages, let's say, maybe you would have a summary block that's a couple of paragraphs long, and then maybe a couple of paragraphs of response. So don't think that this has to be just one paragraph each. It doesn't. I just chose to do that in this particular case. So when I shift to the response for this particular method, I probably want to start by giving a one-sentence statement. You can think of it kind of like a thesis, where I make it clear what I think of Granoff's argument as a whole. So I did that in the very first sentence here. Although there are some appealing aspects of Granoff's proposal, when put into practice, his plan might be too optimistic and could hurt students more in the long run. So I'm trying to make it clear in the very first sentence that while there are some things that I like about his proposal, I'm concerned and I don't think it's completely realistic in practice, right? So don't feel like when you're responding that you have to be entirely positive or entirely negative. I think more often you are going to be doing a little bit of both, like I did here. What you like about something, what you don't like about it, right? So just know that that's okay to do. But in this paragraph, and again, you can replay this and look at it more closely later, basically what I'm doing is giving my opinion about various things that he says within the text, right? So, I'm kind of questioning how realistic it is to expect businesses to take less money in the short term. I'm kind of questioning whether students will have to pay more if they're in small classes. So again, raising questions is something fine to do as a response, but mostly in this paragraph, I'm disagreeing with what Granoff is saying. But again, it sounds a lot more argumentative than the first part. So at the end of this paragraph, I chose to kind of just put my concluding section as part of my response. You could do a separate conclusion paragraph if you want to. But again, I think that's your personal choice. But let's look specifically at the ending here. A good thing to do in the concluding section of a summary and response is to both sum up your view or your reaction, but also explain why this matters. Why is it significant, what you're saying, right? So let's look specifically at the last sentence here. I said, if we were to implement his solution without testing its feasibility in a real-life setting, this could ultimately fail to address the financial burden students face and lead to more stress and inequality than exists under the current system. I'm saying students can be worse off if we do this without really testing whether it's going to work or not, right? So I'm showing why it matters. We don't want to hurt college students any more than they're already struggling, right? So again, I'm just expressing concern and saying I like the idea of this proposal, but there are certain things that Granoff hasn't convinced me of yet, right? So again, this is how it might look if you choose to go with option 1. Let's shift now and go to option number 2. See how that might look. So in this option, you would create an introduction, and again, it's going to be giving a little bit of summary, but here you're going to have your thesis at the end of your introduction. So whereas in the first one, by the end of the intro, we don't know what the writer is going to say about this text, in this option, you let the reader know kind of up front what you think, and then try to support that later in the essay. Like it says here, each paragraph is going to go point by point and give a little bit of summary and then response to that summary within the same paragraph. Like I said, you just have to be a little bit more careful about giving signal phrases because you want to make sure it's clear what belongs to you and what belongs to this other writer. But I think this option works really well, especially if you have to do an extended summary and response. And honestly, I think that you guys, when you start essay number 2, probably the better method for that assignment is going to be this option, where you bring up a little bit of summary from the text, but then respond to it immediately after in the same paragraph. So, my intro, it's going to start out the same as it did in the previous option, but in this method, I'm going to shift from summary to response in the middle of this intro. So notice in the middle where I say, he's right that the current textbook system creates an unfair financial burden for students, but the solution he provides to address that problem is not supported by any real evidence to prove that it would be effective in practice. So I go from at first explaining here's what he says to starting to give my opinion on it, right? I want to give the audience a sense up front of what I'm going to talk about in more depth later, right? So in the previous option, I gave what we call the thesis as the first sentence of my response section. I kept that same sentence, but here I just moved it and put it at the end of the introduction, so that by the end of this intro, my audience knows that I sort of agree but sort of disagree with what Granoff is proposing. And I'm going to use the rest of the essay to try to support that. So let's look at just a couple of these body paragraphs here. So, in my first paragraph, I'm just going to bring up kind of one point. So one thing that Granoff proposes is that schools should license textbooks from publishers. And he claims that publishers would make more money by doing this. So again, that's all summary, these first couple of sentences. Here's what Granoff says. But then after I give some summary, then I respond to it immediately after. While this may be true, he does not seem to consider how these publishers will react in the short term when they're making significantly less money all at once like they're used to. So again, this is just straight from what I used in the previous example, right? So then, next paragraph, I'll start discussing a different point from Granoff. Again, starting with summary, but then following it with response. So again, another point that he makes is that if we start doing this licensing thing, then, students will have to pay less, which sounds great, right? So again, I just give that information first, and then I follow it with response. Granoff provides no evidence that this will be a functional solution in a real college setting, right? And again, these are short paragraphs. You would probably want to add a little bit more explanation to them, but I just want to show you the idea. And then I said here, you're just going to do this over and over again. Bring up any summary point that you can respond to, and then follow it with your opinion. And just do this several times throughout the essay. Here, I chose to do the conclusion as a separate paragraph, right? It's exactly the same conclusion that I had in the previous example, but I set it apart. And it's still showing why this matters. We don't want students to be worse off than they are now, right? So again, just a couple of things to think about if you ever have to do this type of assignment. And I hope this helps. Okay, thanks. Bye.